We are live.
We are live. Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy,
I'm Hygo.
and we are starting a podcast together because we're stuck indoors
Yep.
and we have nothing better to do, and everybody else in the world has a podcast, so we figured why not the two of us?
Exactly.
we are two pastors serving in the Armenian evangelical community, and both of us met back in seminary. Do you remember the first time we met?
Not exactly, but I know when we met regularly. Do you remember the first time we met?
I think the first time we met, I have a vague memory because I was exhausted, but we were on the committee on youth together, and I flew in on a red eye.
That's right.
And
You're wearing sunglasses.
I walked into a meeting. It's like 9 a.m, like total Big Lebowski style, crazy hair and sunglasses, and I was just making nonsense in that meeting.
Yes, I remember now. I try to suppress bad first impressions.
Yeah, I don't think I made a great impression on you.
But we got to know each other because we were learning Armenian at the Panera in Glendale.
That's right.
And we would meet to learn our Armenian, and then we would end up talking about philosophy, theology, current events, Armenian community, American community, you name it.
With Master Vahe Chaputian,
who was our Armenian teacher.
Shout out to Vahe, who taught us Armenian and how to complain about politics in Armenian.
Thank you, Vahe. Good times.
In Panera. I think when we first met at that weird COY meeting, I think you asked me what I was interested in theology, and I said I was interested in church history and Athanasius, and you had this face of like, what the hell does this guy know about Athanasius and church history? That's how like messed up I looked that morning.
Got it. I was excited probably.
Total goof.
I'm really bad at my facial communication because I tend to be like very stoic.
Yeah.
So it's hard to read what I feel like a lot of people have a bad facial interpretation of what I'm communicating.
Gotcha.
But that could just be my insecurities speaking, but I tend to be too stoic or don't show emotion.
I feel like I'm the opposite. I feel like the Tovmassians have a rich tradition of showing their expressions on their facial. That didn't make sense. Showing their emotions through facial expression. I don't really hide the way I look.
Right.
Or the way that I feel. Cool. So we're coming up on Holy Week. This has been a weird season. We're all stuck indoors in quarantine for coronavirus, and it probably looks like we'll be there for like the next month.
Yep. Probably till the end of summer or the beginning of summer.
Yeah, I hope not the end of summer. But so we have to like rethink how we do a lot of this stuff. So remind me what you're doing for like regular ministry now that everything is online. What are you up to?
So yeah, just moving the church services to Facebook Live and over Zoom. Those have been really helpful, especially the Zoom creates a community. So we have time of sharing and praying and getting updates from people. Cool. Doing online lectures, also via Zoom, where I'm just still doing Bible study, but it's been really cool because as a pastor in New York, I'm connected to a lot of people from different cities internationally. And it's been really cool to feel like an international church in many ways because we're always getting guests from different parts of the world for each of our services now that we're online. So that's been really cool. And to hear updates on different parts of the world and kind of seeing the church as this multicultural, multi-city community, which is it's been really cool in that regard. But nothing beats the meeting face to face, hugging someone, having communion in person, praying with laying on hands. Like I think people are gonna be more appreciative of this, of just the human touch right after all this is done. But what about you?
Yeah, kind of a lot of the same as you. I mean, we're doing pre-recorded messages, and we blast those out every Sunday morning, and we do midweek Wednesday devotionals that we're sending out every week. And then we did our first Zoom Bible study where people could interact and ask questions. And Zoom's a great platform. It feels like it's been pretty smooth in terms of using it for Bible study. So
Yeah.
that was, like you said, same kind of thoughts. Like, it's kind of cool, people that I've been disconnected from just geographically, they pop up on the meeting. My father-in-law and mother-in-law jumped in on the Bible study. People just can connect in a lot. They can tune in a lot easier, and so it's made for interesting times. I don't know, like you said, I think it does kind of create a realization that these things can be utilized even after this whole isolation thing, and we can feel more globally connected, as not just an Armenian evangelical community, but as a Christian community.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, you've been doing some of this stuff before this isolation took place or the quarantine took place, but there's a lot of stuff where I'm thinking, why didn't we do this before? Like, it's really hard to get everybody together at the church. It's still even harder. I mean, it's just as hard to get people together in a home. So maybe this is just a second best until we get everybody together to church on Sunday mornings.
Yeah, this thing forced people to fully embrace the digital technologies. I mean, most companies are already using it. More cutting edge churches are already using it, but the smaller businesses, the smaller churches, they were forced to do this, and it's just a adaptation of the digital communication that we're in. I think this was it's like it just forced everyone to just embrace it and learn it.
I don't know. The only alternative to this I've seen so far on like Twitter is drive-in church. Have you seen this?
No, what is a drive-in church?
people like actually pull up in their cars like to go into a drive-in theater, and pastor gets up on a stage and stands outside and performs for them, and then everybody gets in their car. Well, everybody stays in their car. Everybody slowly exits, and I think it's kind of strange, but some people are doing it. I guess it works in some places. If you think about like the older population, people who don't have, like my church, there's things skewed towards the older age in terms of congregants. So there's a few congregants who are just disconnected because they don't have any sort of access to internet or computer. So I guess for that segment of a population, it sort of works. But
it totally gives a new meaning to fast food Christianity.
There you go. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah, it's pretty hilarious.
Fast food Christianity is
explain what that is.
It's like it's a kind of a critique on American Christianity, where there's a shallowness to it at times, or it's just trying to pitch something or feed you something that's not necessarily nutritious for you in the long run, but it kind of satisfies and entertains you in the short term. And that's just a general critique of certain church cultures where there's no depth to the spirituality that is so rich and nutritious and wonderful. And I think part of the cool thing about the two of us, I guess, kind of makes us a little bit different than your typical podcast. We do come from a rich Christian heritage that was forged from persecution and faithfulness. Armenians were the first Christian nation in 301 AD, but we're also part of a reform movement that happened in 1846, where 40 men and women gathered to bring reform among the Armenian Orthodox or the Armenian Apostolic Church. So it's kind of an interesting Protestant take on one of the oldest church traditions, but also being from an Armenian background, we're kind of in between the East and West worlds. So it definitely feels like we'll have a different insight just naturally because of our upbringing. But what are your thoughts on just being an Armenian evangelical? What does that even mean to you?
Yeah, like you said, we tap into a really deep, rich, ancient Christian tradition. So American evangelicalism doesn't maybe really claim to be as, it doesn't seem to go as deep in terms of tradition as Armenian evangelicalism. We have a deeper connection to church fathers and understanding of the way the Christian tradition developed over the ages. And like you said, I think Armenians just generally as a culture are, I've used this language a lot more recently, but they're a broker culture. So we're kind of between two worlds. We're always between East and West. And so we've had to navigate holding, politically, religiously, economically. We've had to sort of figure out how to navigate two worlds. I think recently we had that peaceful revolution in Armenia, and most people who observed it and analyzed it said one of the reasons it was so successful was because it didn't take sides between East and West. It decided to be a purely Armenian, like, national revolution. It didn't make enemies with Russia. It didn't make enemies with the West. It just wanted to be itself. And I think, that's kind of indicative of the way our culture works. We're trying to broker a way to navigate between the rock and the hard place, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah, for those who are more interested, Google the Velvet Revolution in Armenia. It just happened last year. It's still kind of
last year.
It's still ongoing. It's pretty cool what's happening.
Yeah. I think now they're trying to figure out how to govern. Now that has sort of succeeded, they're trying to figure out how to organize a government around free and fair governing. So yeah, I think we have definitely our food is probably not going to be fast food.
No, it's Lebanese Armenian fusion. That's the stuff fusion. That's the stuff we grew up on.
Yeah.
Some of the best food in the world.
Best of all the worlds. And we're the first to make wine.
Yep.
It's in the Bible, bro.
Have you been to the Adani Caves? I was there a year and a half ago. It's a part in Armenia where it's the oldest winery.
Yeah. No, we didn't get there when we were there.
They're still excavating it, and they're kind of renewing the wine industry. It's pretty cool area. It's a lot of history. I've had there.
It's amazing wine, but I haven't been to the winery. Cool. What's going on for you for Holy Week? What are we doing for Holy Week this year? So, now that everything has changed.
Yeah, so we're moving to an online Holy Week service. So Holy Week starts on Palm Sunday. It ends with Easter. It's kind of like the NBA playoffs for pastors. There's usually multiple services going on.
Yeah.
People get really into the faith that they're in this week. And we're going to just kick things off with a Palm Sunday worship service this coming Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to do something a little risque, which we're looking to do an ecumenical Maundy Thursday service or Holy Thursday service, where we're going to do it online and actually do something where we do virtual communion. So people have to bring their own wine, their own bread, and their own meal. And we're going to do it over Zoom. And then we're just going to do Easter. I don't know if we're going to do a Good Friday service, but
yeah, that's a lot to do a Good Friday service too.
Yeah.
Do you guys typically do a Good Friday service?
Sometimes it depends. If we were a bigger church, we would probably do it more regularly. But so it's like every couple of years, we kind of figure things out. It's interesting I pastor a church in Middle Manhattan, a lot of young professionals, and unlike most churches, during the holidays, the church empties out because people usually go home. Yeah. So we have like an inverse effect. So some of our least attended gatherings are during the holidays.
Yeah.
So it's hard to pull off multiple holiday services if you're a small urban church in the middle of the city.
Yeah, it's hit or miss for us. We get a lot of visitors in the summer. Winter, there's not very many people coming to Chicago in the middle of winter for the holidays. So, but I mean, we're kind of a Midwest culture, so there's a lot of, family coming back home and stuff like that. So there's an occasional, it's a little different than Manhattan for sure, but we have sort of the similar experience. I love the Good Friday service. We have a Good Friday service every year, and it's one of my favorite services. Call it a service of darkness. It's just a pretty epic name.
Yeah.
But it's part of a tradition where at Good Friday, you close the service. You kind of track the stations of the cross all the way to the crucifixion and the burial, and then after the burial, the whole church goes dark. All the candles go out, all the lights are out, and everybody leaves in darkness. So that on Sunday morning, when they come for the resurrection, all the doors are burst open, the lilies are all out, and the light is shining bright. So it's kind of like a reenactment celebration of the resurrection. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go to Palm Sunday.
Yeah, so I think,
what are you gonna teach Palm Sunday? What are you working with?
So Palm Sunday is always weird to me because it's like growing up as a kid, it's like you carry these palms into the sanctuary. Jesus comes on a donkey, and it's like, yay.
It's like what's going on?
And part of me is still thinking that way. Like, what is really going on here? So,
yeah.
But yeah, I think there's 2 points I'm going to flesh out. Like why Jesus came into Jerusalem, and kind of how he kind of angered different people by the end of the week. And I think it's revolved around the concept of him coming to renew the temple system, or to destroy and rebuild the temple system. And then the other is to come as a king. So the first point is crucial because it's kind of the death and resurrection piece where he's renewing the whole system or fulfilling the whole system, and that'll anger the religious leaders of his community. But then you have the claim of him being the Christ or the king, where it angers the Roman authorities. So I've been thinking about kind of that concept of Jesus coming as both the priest who renews the temple system or fulfills the temple system, and Jesus coming back as the king to reclaim the promises of God. So you have the Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled in this act of Jesus coming to Zion, to Jerusalem, to fulfill the priestly duties and also to take back the throne to God.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
But it's hard to see all that because it's just a guy on a donkey and people with palms and screaming Hosanna. But it's extremely rich.
Yeah, there's a couple things. Like, for one, like I feel like Palm Sunday is difficult because you have to situate Palm Sunday within like the whole narrative of the Bible. Like some of the other passages that you work with during the year, they're not so contextual. But this is one of those Sundays where like it doesn't make sense unless you situate it in the context of God coming back to his temple and his city and his people and making things right. Which always takes a lot of time to set the stage. You feel like, am I over explaining this? But most people are like not going to know that narrative. So you have to do that. But then there's also kind of a cool element that didn't strike me until you just sort of brought it up. But, in the Old Testament, generally in the Reformed tradition, there's always been this kind of threefold office of a prophet, a priest, and a king, right? And so typically in the Old Testament, those are all held by different individuals. It's kind of like the U.S. government. There's the executive branch, the legislative, and the judicial, and they're not supposed to, sort of like a checks and balances. So a king is never to be a priest, and a priest is never a king, and a prophet never. But it's interesting that in the texts on Palm Sunday, Jesus melds all of those offices into himself. So he comes as king, he comes as the priest who cleanses the temple, and he comes as a prophet because he pronounces judgment. In Luke, I think it's in Luke, he comes and he cries over Jerusalem. and says how often I would have taken you and gathered you together. What is it, like hens? Is that what it is?
I think so. Yeah.
I think it is.
We'll have to look that
We'll have
up.
to look it up. But it's interesting how Jesus sort of gathers all those three offices up and then walks right in and becomes the prophet, the priest, and the king in one movement. There's also, I call Palm Sunday the Sunday of irony. I feel like Palm Sunday is just a Sunday to just revel and celebrate the irony of what's going on in the scene, like beyond just that whole cliche thing of the people who sing Hosanna are saying crucify him on Friday, but like just the deeper sense of like he's riding on as a king. People are like celebrating him as king, but nobody realizes what that means. Like they're speaking truth deeper than they know. He's riding on a donkey, a colt. Like it's just a really like embarrassing scene for anybody who's actually a king. And yet the reality is that's exactly what he's doing. That's what God is doing. Yeah. I like that one of the ways I've heard Palm Sunday, or at least Jesus's entry into Jerusalem, sort of framed as you ever heard of like performance art?
What do you mean by
Performance
that?
art is like when people will walk out into like public. Oh, like the people who will like have a flash choir in the
Yeah.
middle of like Times Square. That's performance art, where people will like show up in public and do some sort of shocking thing to make a point and to be sort of cutting edge and edgy. And so I kind of have found Jesus's movement there during Passover, coming in, claiming, like doing all the things that a king would do, but in a very unassuming way, is sort of a piece of like performance art, trying to get a point across to the people that they'll remember forever.
Because right, like the Old Testament, King Saul rode in a donkey to Jerusalem. There's this
David.
There's this longing that the kingdom will return, so that there's that direct connection from the
Yeah.
Old Testament kings.
Yeah.
And then there's also the prophecy. Is it Zechariah that he will come on a donkey?
Yep.
And then you have a lot of these temple imagery from Ezekiel and coming from the east. So and in Isaiah as well. There's a lot of Old Testament passages to talk about, to explain it. So it is kind of overwhelming, because I feel like this is next to Easter. This is like the top three, especially in the Armenian culture. I would even say more people come to Palm Sunday at times.
Yeah. Well, we have food on Palm Sunday, so definitely.
Yeah,
exactly. Come on Palm Sunday.
Palm Sunday dinners, luncheons.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain, like you said earlier, like just all the build up to this moment, and it's confusing if you don't unpack the Old Testament. And I think it's especially if the people who normally come to a Palm Sunday aren't there for the Bible studies on a weekly Sundays to know the Old Testament, and even those who attend church on a regular basis. A lot of churches don't preach about the Old Testament passages that explain the significance of this event. So it is actually a big challenge for pastors, I think, because I think, like you just said, that cliche, like, oh, the crowd on Sunday is saying Hosanna, God save us, and then their same is crucify. Yeah, but it's probably more complicated than that.
Yeah. I think you nailed it on the head. I think part of the problem with Palm Sunday is it doesn't make sense unless you plug it in to the broader Old Testament narrative. Like, you can get away with not connecting things to the Old Testament and some other passages of the New Testament, but Palm Sunday is one of those things that you just, if you don't know the historical theological background of the Old Testament, then it's just like a swing or miss. Like, it's a swing and a miss. You can't catch it. One thing I think is helpful, and I just thought of this as we were talking, for thousands of years, one of the ways the church has framed Easter is through the recapitulation of the Exodus story. And there's I had a professor who used to say, you can't understand the Gospels unless you understand Exodus, and you can't understand Exodus unless you understand Genesis. And so one of the ways to frame the Palm Sunday story is sort of the beginning of the Exodus narrative, leading up to Easter. So like God is coming to Jerusalem, and in the paradigm of the Exodus story, Jerusalem has become the Egypt, it's become the Pharaoh, it's become the oppressor. And so Jesus is showing up as Moses in one way, like, let my people go. He's showing up as priest in another way, cleansing the temple, and prophet in another way, saying Jerusalem has become the Egypt, it's become the oppressor. And in all that, God is coming to Jerusalem and saying, you know, a new Exodus is taking place. What do you think
Yeah.
about that? Is that
I
missing
mean,
anything?
no, it makes sense to me. I mean, this event happens in all four Gospels, and then you have the Passover motif throughout his arrival, you know, and then the Last Supper. It's all about reenacting that exact story. So it's definitely there, but it goes back to you have to know your Old Testament to
Yeah.
understand the sacrifice of Christ and
Yeah.
what his salvation will redeem us from. So, like, absolutely. I mean. And Paul talks about this in the New Testament too. It's definitely always quoted back to in good sermons where Christ redeems us from the bondages of slavery, of sin and death, and Satan. And
Yeah.
his blood is the salvific blood that covers us and protects us
Yep.
from these things. So it's definitely there. I mean, it's a lot of richness, but it's hard to jam pack all this
Yeah.
on
On a
Sunday.
Sunday morning in a soundbite. I mean,
Especially when there's food and kids carrying palms.
yeah, exactly. I think, and to tie it back to like to Genesis, like one of the things I think so this might take us down a slight rabbit trail. We don't have to go this way if we don't want to, but one of the things we lose sight of sometimes is when we talk about Israel or Abraham and his family as a people chosen by God, I think we forget that that's within the broader context of the cosmos, of the world. So whatever's happening in the Exodus story is happening for the world, right? So it's not like it's just happening for these people. And the Exodus story is God judging oppressive, unjust Pharaoh and systems that are unjust and oppressive for the sake of creation to thrive and have life, right? So that's how it's connected to Genesis. There's a really interesting way to read Exodus and the plagues as an undoing of creation for Pharaoh so that creation can be rebuilt and restored and made new and have life. So jumping to the New Testament and going to Palm Sunday, this movement into Jerusalem, like the Exodus, is not just an Israel story, it's a world story. What God is doing there is for the whole world, right? It's not just this like niche community, like it's a broad cosmic story that's taking place there.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, as a Christian, definitely something shifts dramatically uh, by the time of the death and resurrection. The whole cosmos is completely altered and affects us now. And this is the beginning point of all that.
Yeah.
Something of eternal significance that transpires
Yeah.
with the arrival of the Christ coming from the east on a donkey to take back God's authority over this world, like to let God be God again.
Yeah.
It's interesting, this motif of the coming king. You're right. Like my two favorite trilogies is the original Star Wars and Lord of the Rings.
The original. Yeah.
I actually have more. I have more fun bashing the prequels and the new ones than the movies themselves. So it's like it's a weird way to have pleasure by critiquing the new movies. I find more joy like listening to internet trolls on YouTube than the actual movie.
Yeah.
But where was I? Okay, so the first Star Wars episodes 4, 5, and 6. The sixth one is the Return of the Jedi. So it's the reestablishment of the returning order. And then in Lord of the Rings, you have the Return of the King. The long-awaited king has come back. Like for human history, this is the return of the king. This is God fulfilling his promises in the most mysterious and profound way, embodying the person, his son, Jesus Christ, who was sent to retake dominion for this world, like to retake his city for the peoples of all the nations, to fulfill the promises that were long awaited. The long expectations are found in this moment where the king is returning, and God could return. The people could return back to God.
Right. And for that, like that Eden image of life and thriving and flourishing to take off in the world, right? That's the aim of God, to restore a world that's become disconnected and as a result broken and unjust and oppressive because of that disconnection.
Right.
I think it's interesting that like you mentioned, so the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Star Wars trilogy, so many other like pop culture references could be brought up, just literature in itself for centuries and centuries, like it's captured by this idea, right? So there's something interesting. There's this is like bizarre, it's a little bit off topic, but there's this whole branch of psychology called Jungian psychology, and it deals with like archetypes and the collective subconscious. Basically, its argument is that there's this like collective subconscious that contributes to all humanity to some degree, and it's like it works under the radar and we don't even know sometimes that it's there. And so there's this sense that like that in our collective human subconscious there is this desire to be reconnected with God, and there's this desire to have this story where God orders things and makes things right. And it's all kind of summed up in this scene of Jesus walking right into Jerusalem and starting that story of making things right. We all kind of want that, right? Like we all desire it, whether we like communicate it the same way or not. Like it's a deep human longing to have things be made right. How that works is always, the devil's in the details, as they say, but there's that desire in all of us, I think.
Right.
With relationships, with systems, with politics, with whatever it might be, like we all want things to be set right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe that's a way into Palm Sunday. I don't know. Maybe that's a way to phrase what's going on here. But yeah, I don't know. Maundy Thursday is always an interesting one too. Do you know where Maundy comes from? What that word means?
Yes, I think it's the Latin word for command, right? So it's the new commandment. So Jesus says, a new command I give you, to love others as I love you, which is fascinating because he says it right after, I believe, if I remember correctly, he says it right after Judas leaves to betray him. So now is the time for fulfillment, where he's about to show the sacrificial love, where he's about to actually die for us. And he's giving this great commandment, and it's the golden mean fully realized. So you have Jesus saying that I am the standard of do unto others as you want to do unto you. And he rephrases that by saying, love others as I love you. Because I think part of the problem of this world is we can't really discern what's good and evil. And going back to the Genesis story, when the first parents ate of the forbidden fruit, knowing good and evil, we took on the role or responsibility of God, knowing what's right and wrong. And Jesus is saying, I am coming as God's begotten son. I'm here. I've showed you what's goodness. I'm the Lord who knows right and wrong. Like I've shown you what this looks like. What is good? What is evil? What is love? What is selfishness? And I'm now commanding you and reminding you with this meal that we're going to have, to love others as I love you.
Yeah. So I was just, as you were talking, I was just pulling up John 13, which is like the beginning of that whole love feast. Which is, again, I mean, just slightly touching what we already touched. It's an Exodus thing, right? Because it's a Passover meal. But it's interesting, like you said, so the beginning of the scene starts with Jesus washing his disciples' feet and beginning the dinner that way. And Judas is there. So you imagine Jesus washing the feet of the man who's going to betray him, who's spent years with him, and now he's going to, end up condemning him to death. So he's washing this guy's feet. He's washing his enemy's feet. And then at the end of that scene, he issues the bread and the cup. And as soon as Judas receives the bread, he takes off. He runs away to do the deed. And it says it was at night, right? Which is like a huge John theme of light and dark. So he goes off into the darkness, and he just, so that whole image of this commandment to love is set within the context of love being a very difficult thing. like that whole scene is set up for you to realize that, like, the love Jesus is talking about is a love that turns enemies into friends. It's a love that is willing to put yourself out on the line and be vulnerable. And so it's funny that, like, we just turn Maundy, Thursday into, I mean, for me growing up, Maundy, Thursday was when I got Vosbov Kufte. Vosbov Kufte is like this non-meat kebab looking thing. It's lentil kebab, I guess you could call it, if you're not familiar with Armenian.
It's a vegetarian
food.
Kebab.
Like vegetarian kebab.
Made of lentils, and it's delicious.
It's amazing. It's so good. Makes you super gassy, which is maybe TMI, but it's
true.
It's the best. So I remember, like, Maundy, Thursday was the day I got to fast for a while, and then when I got to church at night, I got Vosbov Kufte. It was the best. And it's, of course, it's vegetarian because it's still Lent and we're not supposed to be eating meat. But the significance of that Thursday is huge. I mean, it's like to make it about the difficult task of taking a posture in the world that is loving even in the face of your enemies is just a radical day.
It's remarkable. Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's like right in the center of the story. So it's like Palm Sunday, and then you've got this day where you're supposed to remember the commandment to love one another, just as Jesus is going to. And then Friday is the day where you're like, this is what that means.
Yeah, I mean, he practices what he preaches and preaches what he practices. He says, no greater love is this, that a man lay down his life for a friend.
Right.
Literally sacrificing your life is the what he means by love.
Right.
Which is another part of the problem. Because we normally, when we think about love, we're thinking about the emotion of feeling in love. All our movies, all our pop songs, they are pointing towards this just temporal feeling. And when the Bible talks about love, God is love. What love is, it's this agape love, which means a charity. It's a giving on to another person love. Not that it's not wrong to have the emotions of love, usually, but what we're talking about, what Jesus is defining here, is this action of putting others before you, giving without expecting anything in return, to the point of giving your own life to others.
Yeah.
Whether they're your enemy or your best friend. And going back to that motif of Jesus is having a meal. It's funny, Psalm 23, right?
Yeah.
What's the line with, in the presence of my enemies, I'll set a table before me. It's like, whoa, why is the Lord preparing me a table of food in front of my enemy?
I feel
Um,
like that's the one of the most misinterpreted texts in the whole Bible. Like, it's so, people go to Psalm 23 and it's like, yeah, I get to eat a meal and humiliate my enemies. But this that's not quite what it means.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, love is this commandment. And the other thing about the Maundy Thursday is it's a command. It's not an option.
Right.
It's like, this is not like, oh, if you feel like it. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
this is not like a mysterious parable to figure out here. This is
Right.
a command I give you,
Yeah.
like a
Yeah, yeah.
duty, like a responsibility you have. Go
Yeah.
love people as I love you.
Yeah, and this instruction, this commandment. So, I mean, in the Old Testament, commandment is Torah, right? It's the way to live your life, right? Torah is the wisdom to live your life by. It's the instruction to live your life by. And here Jesus is taking love and holding it up as the instruction, the command for all of living, right? So if you plug all of Holy Week together, you've got Palm Sunday, the beginning of this Exodus, this salvation event. You've got Maundy, Thursday, where you're coming in, and this is the commandment. This is the instruction. The people who are going to follow me and live with me are going to live by this love. Good Friday, this is what love is, right? I mean, John holds this up in all of his letters. You want to know what love is? Jesus on the cross. That's love, right? And then Easter is this like party, this celebration, that love that looks foolish and ridiculous to the world, that love that loves one's enemies and sacrifices for people who hate you, is actually the victory that overcomes the world. And that's the way that the instruction of love brings life to the world, right? Through that self-sacrifice and that giving to one another. And not in the sense that we become these like spineless doormats for other people, but in ways that, like, when we love somebody selflessly and then that disarms, the aim is that disarming of the other invites them into a different way of being with you and with other people. Like, it starts a new pattern of relationship with other people. When you love somebody sacrificially, the expectation is that begins a different, in very technical language, it disrupts the system. It disrupts the way we interact with one another, and that disruption invites a different way for us to be in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just thinking about, like, right after the meal, what the commandment is given, there's the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is praying to
Yeah,
God.
beautiful.
It's fascinating because Jesus doesn't feel like doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, he's like, I
It's
don't
like
want
the
to do it.
exact opposite of what we
Yeah.
talk about love. I don't want to do this, Lord. If
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
another way, God.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then getting to that point of completely surrendering, not my will, but your will be done. Relying on God's grace, the
Yeah,
Father's grace, to actually have the strength to love sacrificially.
yeah, dude.
Uh,
One of the coolest things about that Gethsemane scene is the way, again, like, I'm just gonna go back and like nerd out with Old Testament themes and symbols, but he's in a garden, okay, like totally Genesis, and he's kneeling before a tree, right? Praying before God at a tree. And at this moment, he's making the decision that Adam and Eve, like, he's not making the decision that they made, but he's at a crisis point where he has to make a decision along the lines of the decision that Adam and Eve made. Am I going to decide what is good for me in my own eyes, or am I going to give that up to God and decide that this way is the way that I'm walking into, this way is what's good in his eyes? And just to see that scene as the recapitulation of the garden and the restoring of that potential for there to be life and thriving in the world through him surrendering to God and acting in love even for his enemies. It's beautiful. It's cosmic. I mean, I feel like, at least personally, the way I grew up reading the Bible, it might have been stymied because I wasn't given the eyes or the whatever, the tools to read the Bible in that way, where you're bringing all of these different rich images together at different scenes and seeing how they pop and how they're meant to be connected. And the fancy language we give, I guess, to it in New Testament studies is like intertextuality, how the texts are talking to one another back and forth.
Right. Right.
It's such a better way to read the Bible, man.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's always funny, the concept of east of Eden. We're exiled east of Eden.
Yeah.
And Jesus coming from the east, and bringing and restoring the ability to be in the presence of God.
Right.
That's pretty much what this is about. Christ allowing us access with God again. He's the mediator. He's the king. He's the priest. He does something that affects us now in the moment 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. It's rich. I mean, and then we get to Easter. I guess we skip Good Friday.
Let's talk about Good Friday and Easter in the next podcast.
Yeah.
Let's not.
Yeah, we've gone a long way.
We covered Palm Sunday and Maundy Thursday in our first inaugural episode of Christ and Coffee podcast.
I feel like Easter itself could get its own thing. But we'll meld it all together. Good Friday and Easter are probably going to take a full podcast moment.
Yeah, and then I want to go on a rant about how the Holy Week narrative doesn't make sense if Jesus Christ doesn't ascend. Ascension is often left out in the Western churches.
Yep.
In the gospel is not completed until Christ ascends. And we'll talk about that because it's really, I feel like that's hard to explain. So we need a whole other episode on ascension. All right. So we have our next couple of episodes.
We can do ascension and Pentecost together maybe.
Yeah.
So we can, there you go. So we'll do dyads.
Or
we buckled up.
We'll play it 1 week at a time. Thursday. And we'll also take feedback from the two people who've stuck to the end of this podcast. We thank you.
There you go.
For watching.
There you go.
But yeah, so this is part of, we're just going to kind of see how this thing evolves. We pretty much nerd up about our sermons on Sunday. So we figured it'd be good to just put this on a podcast. I feel like we have more fun preparing for the sermon sometimes than actually giving the sermon. So, and when we preach the sermon, you're always limited to a 20-minute slot or an hour slot, depending on your tradition. But there's a lot of build up, there's a lot of prep, a lot of pastors and preachers do beforehand, and they can't give it all at once. So there's always the joy of learning and processing throughout the week. What does the scripture text really mean?
Right.
And hopefully this podcast will give you some insight on the week of the pastor on the sermon. It's not just a once a week event, but something that's constantly being thought about and thought through, and putting our education and degrees to use by having the luxury of studying this. We hope to just have a conversation with you through our conversations. Our weekly text that we're going to be preaching on.
Yeah, one of the things I hear the most is, like, what does a pastor do throughout the week? Like, it's a strange job we have. I mean, we're doing visitations, we're doing prep for sermons, and we're doing connection. We're trying to do administrative tasks and handle those as well. We're taking care of the souls of our congregation, not just the souls, but the lives of our congregations. But I find that at least our generation values authenticity, upfrontness. What's the word I'm looking for?
I think authenticity sums it up.
Yeah.
Just kind of a behind the scenes look. Not the polished sermon on Sunday, but the what goes into that, what really is happening throughout the week.
Transparency is the word I was looking for.
There it is.
Yeah. And so this is kind of a way for people to see how the sort of sermon goes from a text to the development of, the actual Sunday morning delivery. And as you can see, it's not a linear process. It's very circular. It's a kind of winding road at times. And this is part of the art of what we do as pastors. And it's also a commitment both Haig and I share to invite the congregation as a community into part of this process too. So like Haig said, welcome comments and thoughts and ideas that also contribute to what we've talked about here this week. But we'll be posting these, I think, at least now during this season of quarantine. Hopefully we'll be posting one of these every week or so. And we're looking forward to seeing how this takes off.
Yeah, and like again, thank all two of you for sticking to the end of this, and we're just gonna see how this thing organically evolves, and it also helps us preparing our Palm Sunday sermons and Maundy Thursday sermons, just having this dialogue too. So
yeah, it serves two purposes, kills two birds with one stone.
yes, this is the beginning of our sermon prep right here.
There you go. Good times. Well, we'll talk again soon.
All right, brother, this is fun.
I go. Give me a coffee. Cheers.
I drank all of it, so
You drank all of it?
yeah,
oh,
it's
man.
all close, a little bit. Cheers.
Empty cheers.
Yeah, so thank you for watching the first Christ and Coffee podcast. Remember to stay caffeinated and read your Bibles.
That's good. Take it easy, guys.
Take care. Thanks for watching.